Hi, in this lesson you'll continue to learn about methods, specifically passing and returning references of an object. In a previous lesson, you learned about defining and calling methods that use primitive values as their parameters and arguments. Remember that when an argument is a primitive value, the parameter variable receives a copy of that value. When an argument is an object, however, things are a little bit different. In this lesson, you'll explore how to use object references as your method parameters and arguments and see how they differ from their primitive counterparts. For this exploration, let's use a program that helps a library keep track of their books. This program will have two classes in addition to the main class. The first is the book class. This class contains all of the attributes and methods needed for a book object. This includes instance variables for the title, author, and genre, as well as a variable to keep track of whether or not the book is checked out. This class also includes getter and setter methods for each of these instance variables. The second class is the library class. This class has two methods, a method to add a book to the library and a method to check out a book from the library. Notice how the addBook method creates a book object and returns it, and the checkoutBook method has a book object as a parameter. Let's walk through a program to see what happens when you pass in and return reference variables. The program starts by creating a library object using the library class constructor. Then the program uses the library instance method addBook to create a new book object. This method uses the book class constructor to create a new book object with initial instance variable values. Note that the checkout value is assigned a starting value of false by default. The method then returns this book object to be stored in the Hunger Games 1 variable. Let's look behind the scenes and see how Java is handling returning an object in memory. This line creates a variable named Hunger Games 1. Then the addBook method creates a variable named book and creates a new book object. It then stores a reference to this book object in the book variable. Finally, the value of the book variable is returned to the main method where the addBook method was called. An important point to highlight here: when a method returns an object variable, it returns a reference to that object rather than a reference to a new copy of the object. So now the Hunger Games 1 variable stores the reference to the same book object at 0x006. Let's now see what happens when the book is checked out. When you call the checkoutBook method, the Hunger Games 1 variable is passed in as an argument. The condition of the if statement uses the getter method to access the value of the checked out instance variable. Currently, this value is false. Since the book is not checked out, this means that it can be checked out, so the program heads to the else block. The program then uses the book class setter method to change the value of the checked out variable to true. This leads to an important note about how Java behaves when you pass in an object as an argument. The change to the book parameter in the library class alters the state of the Hunger Games 1 variable in the library runner class, even though they are two different variables. Let's take a look at the computer memory again to explain why this happens. The Hunger Games 1 variable stores a reference to the book object. When this variable is passed in as an argument to the checkoutBook method, the checkoutBook method initializes the parameter variable book with a copy of that reference. In Java, when an argument is an object reference, the parameter stores the object reference instead of creating a new object. Because both the book variable and the Hunger Games 1 variable point to the same book object, any change made in the checkoutBook method is going to update the object that is passed in as an argument. This can lead to accidentally changing an object's attributes if you're not careful. With this in mind, you should be very careful about modifying objects when they are passed as parameters. In this case, having the library class change the checkout value of a book object makes sense. However, this is something that you should limit to only very specific situations. One final note to remember: in order to access the private instance variables of the book object, the library class has to use the getter and setter methods because it is an external class that does not have permission to access or modify them directly. Only the methods in the object's class can access the private information that is enclosed. Now that you know about passing and returning objects, it's your turn to try this out in your own programs.